Hi folks, this is David Birchall and this is the rather belated lecture pod for week 7 of Australian politics in spring 2020. I've tried to cram a lot of things into one lecture pod here to save people having to read more than one. And hopefully this is useful for classes in week 7 if you get to it before then. And also, I'm hoping, useful for people for their assignments if you pick this topic, because I've tried to cram some useful stuff here, I think, that is you won't find in the readings for this week. On the right hand side of the screen there, you'll see, of course, a rally that was held in Washington as part of the broader Black Lives Matter movement on this weekend just past, in fact, on August the 29th, 2020. And bottom right hand corner, an earlier and much smaller gathering of people in a coffee house in London. That's coffee pots you can see burning on a stove there on the left hand side. The setting in which, so historians tell us, the idea of civil society emerges as a thing in the 18th century. It's a bunch of blokes wearing wigs, by the way, that's not their actual hair, gathered in a coffee house with their coffee around tables, and what you can see in front of them there on the tables is newspapers, this brand new fandangled thing that emerged in England in the first decades of the 18th century in an amusing historical accident because the government had forgotten to ban them, or rather to censor them. And so the free press emerged out of an oversight by the British government in the early 18th century. And so all these dudes wearing wigs hung around in coffee shops discussing the events of the day. And so, we're told by historians, creating this thing called civil society. First on this thing, representative democracy, and this wonderful phrase that one hears only too often, representative democracy and its limits. Right hand side of the screen there, of course, you can see a couple of different moments in Australian representative democracy. Bottom right hand corner, that's a polling booth in the late 19th century. Top right hand corner, it's a polling booth between the world wars, and the guy with the Texan hat, don't ask. Long story, but that is actually Australia. Okay, first top point here. When we vote in a representative democracy like Australia, we clearly entrust our representatives with the task of making policy judgments on important matters of the day. We don't, in a representative democracy, have the ability to make our voices directly heard in Parliament or to Parliament, other than by contacting our members of Parliament and complaining to them, sending them emails, ringing them, text messaging them, and all the rest. That's not the way representative democracy works. Also, of course, when we vote every 2, 3 or 4 years, thereabouts, and we vote on the issues of the day at that moment. We don't vote on issues that may not yet have become issues, or crises that may not have yet become crises. No one who voted for or against Scott Morrison and the coalition at the last federal election could have seen there was going to be a pandemic. For this reason alone, but this is certainly not the only reason, what sometimes gets called extra-parliamentary political activity by groups operating outside the representative democratic process, has been a more or less constant feature of representative democracy since representation emerged in the 18th century in the United States and in France as a pattern for modern government. But it's not merely the fact that we don't get to express our voices in the way that, say, ancient Athenians did in their assembly, if they had the time and the leisure to get there, that causes people to become active and become what sometimes gets called activists. Rather, there are other reasons as well. Sometimes people wish to speak out against injustices, which might be committed, for instance, in the name of the majority or the people. Governments may conduct policies that people feel are unjust, and do so in the name of the people, the majority, and so people may hit the streets to complain, as it were, on behalf of a minority. Sometimes people protest to highlight the plight of outsiders, people who don't have very many votes or who can't vote at all, or in my case, I guess maybe refugees on Manus Island and elsewhere, people who are probably not going to get a vote anytime soon either. To bring neglected or hidden issues to public attention, things that people don't want to face up to, or that have remained hidden for too long. Indigenous issues were like that for a long time in Australian politics, I think. To shift public opinion, even though the public may have elected a government with certain policies, people sometimes rally and protest to bring to people's attention things the government isn't doing, to attempt to shift their views on things. And lastly, to create a sense of heightened urgency, such as, for instance, in the case of climate change, amongst other things. There may be a problem like that people are aware of, but don't want to focus on right now because they're focusing on other things. And so people protest in order to bring it to their attention and insist they should be focusing on it by jumping on top of railway carriages or whatever it may be. None of these actions necessarily involve repudiating the entire political system. People calling themselves activists, people involved in social movements, aren't necessarily rejecting politics in the representative political sense of that word. They may imagine that what they need to do goes beyond that or above it, or indeed adds to it. They don't necessarily need to believe that it's an alternative to it, even though a few may do. Lastly, activism of the kinds that I'm describing here often draws upon the resources of groups, but not necessarily organised political parties aiming to form government, but other sorts of groups, voluntary associations, support groups of different kinds, lobby groups, enthusiasts and hobbyist groups, whatever it may be, upon the resources of what sometimes gets called civil society, which is to say the things people do in society outside the space of the state to develop their own lives or those of others, or to help pursue a cause. Associations, as I've said there, that engage in political work of some kind, defined broadly, but outside the realm of the state in policy making. So I mentioned already this term civil society, and it's in the title of this week's topic as well. And there's another coffee shop in the top right-hand corner, or rather a coffee house, I should say, the top right-hand corner there in 18th century London. Similar to the other one that you saw before, over to the right-hand side there, you can see the woman proprietress, as they would have said in those days. She's serving the coffee and taking the money. There's a bunch of coffee pots again over there in the corner, and a bunch of dudes wearing wigs talking about the newspapers of the day, which may sound a little bit like your grandpa. Bottom right hand corner there, you can see a demonstration in Poland, at the point of very different Poland, in the early 1980s, when a free trade union, as we would call it, rose up in communist Poland and became a focus of what people took to calling at that time civil society movements, civil society unrest. The term civil society emerges in British political thought and the language of it in the late 17th and 18th centuries. If you've done other units that might, or do other units that involve the thought of John Locke, for instance, you'll notice that in his famous treatises on government, he talks not about society as we would today, but about this thing called civil society, by which he means a space outside the state where people are free to discuss matters in their own fashion without the fear of oppression or repression, which was a kind of special privilege of some folks in England at that time, but not something available to many people in many other parts of the world at that time. Second dot point. In 18th century London, in the world of the coffee house that I mentioned there already, the coffee house becomes a kind of exemplary sphere of civil society, a space that sets an example to other places. As I mentioned already, you have newspapers emerging around about this time for the first time. In a sense, newspapers at that time were a little bit like social media today. They were printed on small printing presses very quickly. They're often quite small, only 2 or 4 pages. They would get around in the streets fast, but because many people couldn't afford them, most people shared them and read them together, either in family settings or more commonly in places like coffee houses and taverns. They'd be shared around, moved around on the tables, and people, mostly blokes, but not exclusively blokes, would argue about the issues of the day. And since, as I've mentioned, the censorship laws for newspapers at that time in England had allowed to lapse, you could do this stuff without fear of being arrested. It was an historically unusual moment. And that's the context that people are referring to when they sometimes call them the modern media or the so-called print press the fourth estate. In the French Revolutionary era, there were three estates in France, the first estate being the clergy, the second the nobility, the third the people. The fourth estate, if you like, was the press, because the press became part of civil society, and by not being suppressed or censored, was able to contribute to sort of a wider open debate. As I mentioned already, in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet era, particularly in the decades from the Second World War up to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991-ish, political commentators and historians would suggest there was very little in the way of civil society institutions in the old communist bloc, but some did spring up in the last decades of Soviet rule. And as I mentioned already, one of the most famous, bottom right-hand corner, was the Solidarity trade union in Poland, which put out a challenge to the government of Poland the day, you can suppress us, but unfortunately we have the support of a large proportion of the population of Poland, and that was not the reason why the Eastern Bloc fell, but it was one reason, and it brought to the attention of political commentators in the West this venerable idea, civil society, the idea that movements outside the state to get activise people around issues of what they saw as freedom and civil liberties in Poland at that time could be extremely effective, even if they didn't have the agency of the state behind them, even if there were no free and fair elections into which they could put candidates. It's the simple fact of appearing on the streets in large numbers in a time when they could have been arrested in itself was enough to change the political climate. More recently, since the fall of the Soviet Union, the term civil society has been revived in Western countries as a kind of backdrop, a framework, a superstructure, if you like, for trying to understand the range of social movements, as they're commonly called, who get out on the streets to protest, make a point, demonstrate, do stunts, all kinds of stuff to bring to people's attention a range of issues, whether they be environmental issues, climate change issues, race relations issues, or in other parts of politics, for instance, the right of individuals to shoot each other. In the United States of America, the National Rifle Association, people both for and against free and freely available abortion, both demonstrated in the United States, and to a lesser extent here at different times. Nor need these associations or groups necessarily be political in the narrow sense. They don't necessarily have to belong, if you like, exclusively to left or right. They can be articulating a range of other issues. Being worried about the futures of platypuses or particular species of animals isn't in itself a narrowly political action, but it may bring people out onto the streets. And yet the ambiguity always presents itself in such movements, which makes them controversial and always gives them detractors, regardless of whether they're on the left or the right or wherever they may be. To what extent, people necessarily ask, can civil society groups claim to speak for or on behalf of the people, or even some large group of the people? And so a complaint will always be raised. Why don't you do this through Parliament? Why don't you do it through politics in the normal way? And why are you claiming to represent the people when I'm the people and I don't agree with you? These tensions are built into, I think, social activism, social movements, and indeed, come to that, even the idea of civil society itself. What's a social movement? Well, you'll be aware the first essential reading up on Views for this week has some thoughts about that. It's a couple of Italian scholars looking at the history of social movements from the perspective of Italy. And of course, you probably don't need me to explain in the top right-hand corner there. You can see Black Lives Matter slogans again in Washington over the weekend, and bottom right-hand corner, a rather famous young woman who probably doesn't need naming, who has been a kind of, in a sense, a charismatic leader, if you like, at the age of 16, of a movement which otherwise really hasn't had leaders. So in the first essential reading for this week, Della Porta and Diani claim that social movements, and they're borrowing from other things they've written when they say this, are a distinct social process, which I suspect is something that hasn't translated elegantly into English out of Italian, and that which they define by three criteria. They say that you can define something as being a social movement, when it's marked by conflictual relations with opponents who are clearly identified, with a strong sense of collective identity of the group who is doing the protesting against the groups against whom they're protesting, and lastly, what they call dense informal networks. There's no hierarchy. There's not a strict hierarchical structure, but there are all sorts of networks closely binding people together. I think there's a useful elements in a description of what social movements are, but they're clearly not capable of defining them completely. They don't explain, I think, why social movements matter or what is unique or important about them. They're a way of defining certain kinds of movements as being social movements and others as not. Whether that serves a useful purpose is a question in itself, but they probably don't explain why we should be talking about them in this topic. I think the easiest way to make sense of it is possibly through the term itself. It's a venerable term. It's been around actually for more than a century now, one way or another. And it's a useful term, I think. The first word in the term social movement, social, I think is meaningful. It suggests that they are not generally, exclusively, narrowly political movements. They're not simply, usually, raising issues that politicians can address through the normal parliamentary means. Normally they're going beyond that and dealing with something broader and less structured. And generally they are not primarily calling upon political parties to do the work of social activism. It's very rarely the case, unless the political parties are small political parties who imagine themselves to be social movements in themselves. But generally major mainstream political parties do not behave like social movements. They're organised around the work of getting people elected to Parliament first and foremost, and social movements are generally not involved in that work. Also, things we call social movements are very rarely hierarchically organised in relation to leadership either. There may be the occasional charismatic leadership figure like Greta Thunberg, but no one could describe Greta Thunberg as a leader in the normal sense. She doesn't issue orders, she doesn't have subordinates, there's no chain of command leading out or below from Greta. She's a sort of symbolic leader, and movements can have leaders like that, but social movements very rarely have structured military-style hierarchical leaderships, unless they're based around small political parties. And lastly, social movements are movements because they are, if you like, in movement. They wax, they wane, they go stronger, they go weaker. The Black Lives Matter movement was dominating the globe for some weeks, then went quiet, and then rose again. The same has happened with environmental groups, with women's groups, and a whole range of other groups. Pro and anti-gun law groups rise and ebb with circumstances, with crises that may come and go. And so the word movement is actually a meaningful one. They are in flux, in motion, in movement. Lastly, to the extent that such movements become owned by or even captured by political parties, if you like, sort of fixed, rigid organisations, organisations aimed at the taking of political power, democratically or otherwise, to the extent that movements get caught up by those parties, they tend to lose their credibility and to wane and lose enthusiasm and support. Spontaneity seems to be the key to social movements. Things have to happen to some extent in the moment. To some extent, people have to get themselves out on the streets without being asked or ordered to. To some extent, everyone has to have the same instinct at the same time. So you can have rallies in Hong Kong last year, it seems like 10 years ago, it was really only last year, where that was clearly true, where people took to the streets in huge numbers in a very confined city like Hong Kong, despite the absence of any evidence of a sort of regular leadership of the model of a political party, or the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and in Europe and also here. Lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter as a social movement, because it's with us at the moment. It's been in the news over the last few months, and it's a case study that you'll find in various of the readings on Views. Top right-hand corner there, you can see the Reverend Al Sharpton, a rather controversial figure in the black community in the United States, addressing that same rally in Washington over the weekend just before week 7, and you'll notice the Black Lives Matters T-shirts are still out in force there, though the rally had a range of different objectives. And bottom right-hand corner, of course, you can see one of many rallies around the world which turned George Floyd into a kind of global, as we necessarily say, icon, even though, of course, he was just one of thousands of people in the United States who have been mistakenly killed by police forces in different places over the last few decades. Okay, so first dot point there, the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota in the United States back in May this year, I think it was May the 25th, something like that, set, as we all know, off a dramatic set of protests across the United States and then also across Europe and the world, including Australia and New Zealand. And the protests were echoed around the world, but everywhere they were slightly different. For the most part, the sky, as I put in the second dot point there, the size and scale of these protests was unexpected. No one quite expected people to take to the streets in those numbers. There was a Black Lives Matters movement that existed and had a sort of structure, but it was clearly not really in control of events. It was overtaken by events. It wasn't really leading events. Events kind of got a logic of their own, pointing back to the previous PowerPoint slide. Likewise, as I said, there had been thousands of individuals who had been mistakenly or wrongly killed by the police in the United States, where policing is rather different from here, over decades. But George Floyd's death created reverberations that none of those really had. The reasons for that aren't absolutely clear. They're probably to do with the political context in the United States at the time, apart from other things. But I think that, again, they highlight the fact that the movement that we've seen spreading across the world this year has had a very strong element of spontaneity and circumstance. It's been driven by a particular moment, a particular conjunction of circumstances, not merely the fact of a black man being killed when he had no need to die. Despite, as I said, the existence of Black Lives Matter groups, most of these things have been spontaneous. Also, they have been, third dot point there, diverse in their composition. Black and white Americans have both been present in the rallies, and likewise in Australia, probably white activists outnumbered Indigenous ones in Australian cities, I suspect. That has been striking as well this year, and commentators in the United States commented on how rallies that in the past had been mostly by rallies by involving black folks complaining about their treatment had become more white folks showing solidarity, to use that phrase, with black Americans and adopting the cause as their own. There has been across America and the world no one series of political or policy slogans or principles that have been invoked, not one simple set of responses. There was a slogan, as you'll be aware, in the United States that talked about defunding the police in the context of the United States, where police services are often run out of local governments or state governments in a whole range of different ways, funded in different ways with different levels of experience and training and different mission statements, and sometimes with large amounts of equipment bought off the United States military at cheap prices. Defunding the police was a popular slogan for a while, but it died away because most Americans, black and white alike, have no particular enthusiasm for abolishing the police forces there, but rather reforming them. In America, of course, there was a specific context. The context was black citizens who had been dying particularly men, who'd been dying in encounters with police, often in seemingly random encounters over minor traffic infringements or sometimes about nothing at all. Quite likely in George Floyd's case, there was, in fact, nothing going on there at all. But in other parts of the world, as the movement spread, it linked itself up to particular themes and issues in the other countries. So general questions of racism, questions of coming to terms with colonialist pasts or slaveholding pasts, as the case of Bristol in the United Kingdom, rates of incarceration in prison for blacks and other minority groups, and so on and so forth. Again, the movement reshaped itself, morphed, changed into different things as it moved around the world into different circumstances. And lastly, I just wanted to mention the issue I mentioned already of white solidarity with this movement. A good part of what has been called social movements over the last few decades have involved solidarity. Obviously, to some extent, environmental movements are solidarity movements. They're solidarity with the environment. since the environment can't speak for itself. The Black Lives Matters movement in America involved a majority of white people, actually, demonstrating in support of black people's civil rights in relationship to the police. To a significant extent, black Americans welcomed this, seeing it as a change from having to demonstrate on their own behalf all the time. But it has also produced certain tensions and brought to the fore an issue that's always been there, I think, in social movements and solidarity politics, of how easy it is for groups trying to demonstrate their solidarity with others to actually take the movement over and make it their own. And so there have been complaints over the last few days and weeks in the United States by black activists that white folks have been trashing the movement by being involved in some of the more egregious acts of violence and looting and burning that have happened across the United States over that time. And so you've seen exchanges such as on this this little Twitter thread here that I grabbed up from Twitter from a few days ago. You'll see an African American by the name of Aaron Sankin, look him up, says, and you can read it for yourself, but he says, as a black person in America, I'm not totally clear on how a bunch of white people screaming at another white person to make a performative gesture for their benefit makes my life materially better in any way. He's responding to incidents in Washington, D.C. last week when predominantly white demonstrators for the Black Lives Matter movement decided to descend on diners at Washington, D.C. restaurants and insist that they show solidarity, and accosted this woman sitting there at a table and started chanting at her in her face. And reporters afterwards discovered that she herself was a Black Lives Matters protester who simply was having lunch. Possibly the young people weren't quite aware of what they were doing. And the incident seemed to some people to suggest the tensions that can exist in social movements when solidarity with other people can lead you to taking the other people's movement in a different direction to the one they may have intended. One last thing I want to mention before winding up here. This topic, of course, is a useful topic to think about when you're doing the second part of the portfolio, the one where you're thinking about how you might create a campaign as a real or imagined social movement. And we'll talk a little bit about that in classes this week and in coming weeks as well. Take care, everybody, and talk soon.